Welcome, everybody. Thomas Metzinger, who is this year's Pufendorf lecturer, is a professor of theoretical philosophy at the Johannes Gutenberg University in Mainz, Germany. And his main research fields concern consciousness and self-consciousness. One of his books is called The Ego Tunnel. And that deals with the problem of what is the self. And in order to explain a little bit about his idea, I ask you to perform a very simple experiment. Close one of your eyes. Then push on your eyeball slightly. And you will see that the world is rocking. It's a kind of nauseating feeling. And this experiment shows that what you see is not the world, but your brain's construction of the world. Thomas Metzinger's idea about the self is similar. You can say that the eye functions as a tunnel between the world and your visual perception. And the self functions as a tunnel between the world and your consciousness. So the self is also a construction of our minds. That's, I think, one of the ideas in this book on the ego tunnel. The ego is a tunnel between the world and consciousness. And then later, he's also been interested in what is the use of consciousness. That's actually the title of a paper he wrote together with Chris Frith. And from there, you take a more evolutionary perspective on why do we have consciousness. And they reject a number of earlier answers to this question, which I find very interesting. And then they propose their own answer, and that is that one of the main reasons why we have consciousness is that it gives us a feeling of agency. And because we have agency, we can judge our actions and we can feel regret. And by feeling regret, we become more social individuals. So there is a connection between having a consciousness and being a social individual. But this is your earlier work in some respects. Later, you've been interested in what is minimal consciousness, minimal self-awareness. And I think this quote, I mean, when you look at consciousness, you want to clear it of as many irrelevant factors as possible. So this will be the topic. The title of the topic of the talks is that it's minimal phenomenal selfhood and minimal phenomenal experience. That will be the title of the first two talks. And the more recent research interest of Thomas Metzinger's is, can we create artificial consciousness? Can we have machines with artificial consciousness? I don't know your answer to this, but I know you don't like the idea, and that will be the topic of the third lecture on Thursday, which is 3 types of arguments for a global moratorium on synthetic phenomenology. Synthetic phenomenology, I take it, is consciousness in machines. So I'm looking forward to 3 lectures and to get new ideas about consciousness, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Thomas Metzinger as this year's Pufendorf lecturer. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So thank you very much for this kind introduction. I feel very honored by this invitation in this very distinguished lecture series. I'm very honored also to be in the series of very distinguished speakers you've invited in past years. I thought I wanted to say thank you to you, not by bombarding you with a ready-made theory or ready-made argument, but just tell you about work in progress in the first 2 lectures, just tell you about a new research initiative I've tried to develop over the last 2.5 years about. And maybe I can even get some of you interested in. So today in the first lecture, I want to give you an introduction into the idea of the minimal phenomenal experience research program. tomorrow I want to look at a lot of new phenomenological data we have created in the last 2 years. And on Thursday, I want to speak about the applied ethics of artificial intelligence, the special case of artificial consciousness. So today we're going to briefly look at some history, some introduction for the first 10 minutes. Then I want to ask, does awareness, I don't know if you've ever asked this question to yourself, have a feel? The consciousness of it all, not the redness and the greenness and the saltiness. And then I want to begin laying conceptual foundations for an interdisciplinary research program on 3 different levels. Tomorrow, I want to present you some new phenomenological data about the experience of pure consciousness in meditation. And I want to then offer you a qualitative analysis. As you will see tomorrow, we have asked expert meditators, 1,183 expert meditators, to verbally describe the consciousness of consciousness. And I'll give you some of the results of it and end with some selected goals for future research. On Thursday, I want to ask the question, what is suffering? And could there be ever anything like conscious suffering in machines? And what ethical implications does this have? But first things first. So what do I mean by MPE? Let's spend the first 10-15 minutes by getting some history. The first idea behind this new strategy is to go from the neurocorrelate of consciousness to a minimal model explanation of consciousness, to try a new strategy. As you may know, I am one of the people who founded the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness. The next year the conference will be in Amsterdam. You should think if you want to go there. Which brings together for more than a quarter century the really leading researchers in philosophy, neuroscience, and so on, interested in consciousness. And we had our first conference, 1997, organized by the late William Banks in Claremont, California. And 1998, I took it to Bremen in northern Germany, where I was a fellow at the time, and organized the second conference about the neurocorrelates of consciousness. This MIT book came out of it. Since then, most neuroscientists think doing consciousness research means finding out the minimally sufficient neural correlate of consciousness. And I find as a philosopher that most neuroscientists have an understanding that there's actually only one kind of scientific explanation that is possible. And here I've copied out from you from the 1948 paper by Hempel and Oppenheim, the Hempel and Oppenheim scheme, where, for instance, consciousness would be your explanandum, and then you would try to have statements of antecedent conditions maybe in the brain, subsume them under general laws, and the target phenomenon would fall out. In a nutshell, most neuroscientists think reductive explanations are the only forms of explanation that there are. Here you have Carl Gustav Hempel for you, who already in 1935 said, psychology is a part of physics. All meaningful statements that can at all be empirically verified can be translated into physical statements. Right? And there are some people who think it's very revolutionary to think about the same thing about consciousness today. Now there's something else, which is called a minimal model explanation. And there you do something else. You construct and investigate models, for instance, of consciousness that include only the core causal factors that create the phenomenon you want to understand. You include only those factors that make a difference to the actual occurrence, no possible worlds, and to the essence of the phenomenon. And you try to create an idealized model of what you want to understand, just the repeatable features, just the fundamental features, just those structural properties that are really relevant for an explanation. There's a technical discussion there in philosophy of science. I'm not interested in this at all. I won't go into this today. But here's just one example. Minimal model explanations have been done in biology, in chemistry, in physics. If you have the ideal gas law, for instance, and you want to derive it, then what you want to explain are large-scale regularities between statistical properties in gases. And these ensemble-level regularities are something you find in many different gases in containers in their behavior. And what you can do mathematically, you can get a pretty good formal level of your formal model of your target phenomenon by idealizing it. For instance, you can assume, I just talked about 3 and 5, the volume is infinitely small of a molecule. You make this as an assumption, it doesn't do anything much to your explanation. Or you assume that molecules don't bump into each other and they don't bump into a wall. You take that out of your mathematical model. You still learn everything you wanted to learn about the behavior of gases. The question is consciousness maybe something like that? An abstract ensemble level regularity between statistical properties? Could we have consciousness without self as an idealized assumption? Consciousness without self-consciousness? Or is it maybe even a real world case? Do we know cases where this happens? The second part of the introduction, I just want to tell you some history where this came from. Minimal phenomenal selfhood was the first research target. MPE, minimal phenomenal experience, is the second one. So maybe some of you remember these old experiments we did creating full body illusions, right? In a lab, if anybody still doesn't know it, I've brought a very old video here. It's 14 years old.
Vision of the subject's own body. We stroke the back of the experimental subject. We had a camera not in front, but behind the subject, 2 meters behind, who was filming the stroking, and in real time projected this information to a head-mounted display, which was in front of the subject eye. So all the subject was seeing is the stroking, but now at your back, while at the same time you see your own body being touched by 2 meters in front of you. And some of the subjects reported that they very strongly felt that of stroking, the subject eyes, we displaced them.
So the young woman you've just seen there, the PhD student, Benja, to the left, she just became a full professor at the University of Konstanz in southern Germany 14 years later. And probably many of you have heard there's a whole industry. We created this experiment first because I, as a philosopher, said, I want a whole body version of the rubber hand illusion. And now, for instance, in Sweden, there's this fantastic group by Henrik Ersson at Karolinska, many of you know. There are excellent people, Arvid Guterstam, who have followed up with fantastic experiments over the last 14 years. And of course, the question was, what happens when you jump into the avatar? What actually happens? What jumps into the avatar? And we thought about embodiment a lot at the time, and we asked what is the most simple form of embodiment, the most simple form of having a conscious self. The answer was location in a spatial-temporal frame of reference. We called this third-order embodiment at the time. Identification with the content of a body image. You just talked about it in your introduction. If the system generates a body image that is transparent, you get the phenomenology of identification, plus a weak first-person perspective, a purely geometric structural feature of a multimodal model of reality, even in a dream. So MPS, the first concept, aimed at picking out the simplest form of self-consciousness. At the time, there was an argument for it. So all three MPS dimensions I just named can be causally determined by purely local causes, by directly stimulating the brain. There were experiments to do that. Through local electrical stimulation, you can give somebody the feeling that they are out of their body. Through multisensory conflict, that's what this experiment did. And the point was that all three types of determining the target phenomenon of selfhood take place in completely passive conditions. That is, agency plays no role. There is a sense of self that has nothing to do with either mental or bodily action. So we published this paper in 2009, and it has, I think, 870 citations by now. The idea still stands. The bold claim was that spatial temporal self-location, self-identification, and a weak first-person perspective are necessary and sufficient for having a sense of self, of being a localized self now, at a point in time and at a place in space. And we used all these experiments with out-of-body experiences in virtual reality labs to investigate this. The most important point is that agency is not a metaphysically necessary condition to have a self. It's just a causal background by which we develop this. So now, we thought for years with my PhD students, what can you take away from MPS without going unconscious? Can you take away location in space and still have consciousness? Can you take away location in time and still have consciousness? Can you take that geometry, the perspective, away? And then the question was, is there something like minimal phenomenal experiences? What is the simplest form of consciousness? That is what I call MPE. So here are 4 questions to make you understand the problem. Is there a form of consciousness that does not instantiate a sense of selfhood, a minimal self? Are selfhood and perspectiveness necessary conditions for being conscious? Can there be something like absolutely non-egoic, selfless consciousness? Second question is, does pure consciousness exist? As you know, Eastern philosophers have said this for more than 4,000 years, that there is consciousness without intentional content. Does something like this exist? Question 3 relates to my introduction. Could we have a minimal model explanation for phenomenal consciousness? Maybe there's an implicit kind of consciousness per se that you are now unaware of, but which actually is always there, all of the time. Or, to put it even simpler, what do you think? What's the simplest form of conscious experience? What is the simplest form of conscious experience? Is there something like a computational essence? Another way to put the question is there one maximally abstract phenomenal property? You have blue, you have red, you have objects, you have multimodal scenes, you have a self looking. What is the most abstract experiential property human beings know? If we had that, maybe we could unify different theoretical approaches on a conceptual basis. So if some of you are interested in this, you can find through my website, there is this website of the MPE project. There's a number of people who work together. There is a more popular lecture explaining it there, and also some open access papers. So I'll tell you what my working hypothesis is, what I start from. I think consciousness can exist without time representation. That means even without a now, without spatial self-location, without the feeling of being here. It can exist without any form, even the weakest form of having a first-person perspective, looking out of your eyes, having sounds centered on your ears. And with any stronger form of egoic self-consciousness, for instance, referring to yourself as yourself using concepts. So I think MPE exists without MPS and without cognitive self-reference. It's a real phenomenon. And what is the best candidate for that? I think it's the experience of pure awareness in meditation. That may be false. That is just my initial hypothesis. But I think that's an example of minimality. That is the simplest form of consciousness we know, the experience of pure awareness in meditation. So now I'm going to give you a very first data point. In July, we published this big study. I'm going to say more about this. You don't have to remember any of this. On which we worked for more than 2 years. We asked more than 3,000 meditators in 5 different languages. Can they phenomenologically describe the experience of pure awareness in meditation to us? In the end, we had 92 questions we asked, and question number 84 was, the experience of pure awareness is the simplest kind of conscious experience I know. People had a slider. They could slide on an analog scale on their screen when they read that question. And there we had a median rating of 80 out of 100 possible points. So this actually confirms my original methodological intuition, because these people say it themselves. Here is report number 3218. The simplest state of awareness perfectly describes my experience. It is utter simplicity. So what I will talk about tomorrow is some qualitative results from verbal reports we got from meditators. But philosophically, it's now very important not to conflate subjective ratings of simplicity with whatever mathematically objective or philosophical measures or philosophical criteria we may develop in the future. It's striking that these people say this, but of course this is an argument for nothing. We have to be very clear about this as philosophers. So I think it is extremely important not to jump into great philosophical theories about consciousness without content and non-dual awareness and enlightenment and cognitive science, but to take the phenomenology really seriously. I'm trying to lay the foundations for an interdisciplinary research program, and I think we have to be very careful at the beginning. We have to look at the actual phenomenology carefully. And I want to do this on 3 different levels before the actual relationship starts. So first you look at the contemplative literature. We have centuries of literature in which the experience of pure awareness is described. We need to do something like comparative phenomenology, looking at different epochs in India, in Middle Age mysticism, at different cultural contexts and with different belief systems. I have done this. I'll say a little bit about this in a minute. I arrive at 6 essential semantic markers in different cultures and different kinds of texts about this. The second level is we need to develop a proper psychometric instrument for MPE. That is, it will be a cluster concept that is not defined by necessary and sufficient conditions by philosophers, but which has a probabilistic structure. It's a region in state space, a region in the state of possible conscious experiences human beings have. I'll say more about this tomorrow and a little bit today. And the third thing where I've been very busy the last year is to build a database of phenomenological reports, refining and different constraints and statistical items. So what I have done is, out of 1183 reports, there were 841 which were really usable. And I've done a qualitative analysis about what jumps at you. I give you 5 unexpected results at the end of this talk. So I think we should first very carefully look at the experience of pure awareness and meditation and see if anything can be learned as philosophers and cognitive scientists. What we actually need is an interdisciplinary research program, and you're all welcome to participate if anybody has a serious interest in this. So for the last 2 years, I've been building a virtual network of people who are interested in this issue of the simplest form of consciousness from all over the world. You have experts on Tibetology, psychometrics, you have neuroscientists and philosophers like Evan Thompson. And I think this we have to create a new interdisciplinary research program for this. Here you see me meditating in a 7 Tesla scanner in Vienna, in Ronald Slutky's group, where we try to do real-time fMRI feedback while I meditate. So you try to see your own brain state and influence it while it happens. I'm very skeptical about this. I think there are many methodological difficulties. I don't think, although it looks very sexy and fancy and science fiction-like, it will work soon. There you see my brain while I meditate. So let's begin with semantic constraints for a concept of pure awareness. This paper is out there as an open access paper for you. And I looked at literature, East and West. I looked at what analytical philosophers like G.E. Moore or Buddhist philosophers said about pure awareness and tried to extract semantic constraints from a very diverse literature spanning many different centuries. MPE, pure awareness, has many historical precursors. For instance, maybe some of you have heard some of them. There's the Dharmakaya in the Buddhist Pali Canon. There's the concept of Rigpa, knowledge of the ground, or looking into the ground, in Tibetan Dzogchen. So that's the idea that there's a spontaneous presence of primordial wakefulness. There's the old, in the Advaita Vedanta philosophy system in India, there's the old idea of the Saksin, the witness consciousness. You may have heard of the idea of the concept of samadhi sometimes in your life, which is often translated as the even intellect, no thoughts, the flat intellect. You find this in the Bhagavad Gita or in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. So the idea is that this is an equilibrium state of the mind where you have no thoughts, just a crystal clear mind, and there are no objects, and there's also no subject. You may also have heard perhaps in popular literature the concept of Sat Chit Ananda, from the oldest literature on existence, consciousness, and bliss. Then there is the possibly 3,000 years old philosophical concept of Turiya, the fourth state of consciousness. The idea is you have waking, dreaming, sleeping, and you have one thing that goes around, a fourth basic state of consciousness which you normally don't notice. And in Vajrayana Buddhism, you also have the concept of Yeshe. I don't say they all refer to the same thing, but there's a deep and long philosophical traditions about this. Now, if I looked at these texts, here are my 6 semantic markers. These are, I try to find something like an essence of pure awareness. So something you find everywhere is wakefulness. Do you know what that means? You know what the quality of saltiness is. You know what the quality of blueness is. Can you feel wakefulness? Can you feel it after you've slept really well, after a very good night? if you've not made the mistake of touching your smartphone or talking to somebody, if you just sat out on the terrace, maybe with your first cup of coffee, and then there was a moment where for 3 seconds you didn't have a thought. 3 seconds only. Just experience wakefulness. That's it. Don't think this is something amazing. I claim you all know it. You just don't recognize it. It's not something dramatic. Then low complexity. There's nothing there. There is no thinking, no feeling, no conceptual or propositional thought, no daydreaming. In pure awareness, there is no perceptual content, no emotional content, nothing sensory-motor. Then there is something that is often called luminosity. The Tibetans say the quality of awareness has a radiant clarity to it. There's a non-visual phenomenal character of brilliance or clarity. Then introspective availability. Most people who have written about this in the history of mankind says you can attend to it. You can have an attentional perspective on it. Semantic constraint was epistemicity, number 5. It's an epistemic relationship, awareness of, but in this case it's awareness of awareness. It's a non-conceptual form of meta-awareness. So the idea is, I don't know if you know of the feeling of knowing, if you have an intuition, a sudden insight, the phenomenal character of non-conceptual insight. A statistician would talk about the property of subjective confidence. A model can have model evidence and subjective confidence for the system. What my point is, there's a phenomenal quality to it. It's the feeling of knowing, and you all know it. And that's part of the pure awareness. And then it looks like there can be a spectrum of transparency and opacity. Awareness itself can be transparent or opaque. Maybe more about this tomorrow. So now I'll give you a brief idea of what we did. We did many pilot studies with meditators and created a questionnaire. And we put it on the internet. And here I'll read you the question. Let me see if this... The question is, this questionnaire investigates all experiences in which there is an awareness of awareness itself, or consciousness of consciousness itself. Our target is the subjective experience of consciousness as such. Sometimes this is also called pure awareness or pure consciousness, and then we told people we are not interested in dramatic spiritual peak experiences. This is not meditation research too, but we're interested in the phenomenal quality of awareness itself, and independently if something else happens or if it's the only thing you have. We put this up. I learned a lot. We put it up in 5 languages. I just looked, 75 people from Sweden, 75 meditators from Sweden filled it in. I'm a philosopher. I have never done anything like this. Shall I tell you what the first thing is I learned? Only 38.7% of grown-up people who want to fill out a questionnaire are able to fill out the questionnaire in a way that you can use it. So we had some 3,600 data sets and we could use only 1,403 of them. You know, because people stop, people jump over questions and do all kinds of things. That's something I didn't expect as a philosopher, but I learned a lot more. So we explained to people, when do you have that? Is there anybody who meditates in this room? 1 point, 2.3, 4.5 people. So we said, during clear and relaxed states of alertness without any thought, during classical sitting meditation, as a natural form of mindfulness with perceptual experience, while you hear or see things, as a natural form of mindfulness in motion. For instance, during walking meditation, during Tai Chi, during the Feldenkrais method, during Hatha Yoga. Something that can spontaneously occur whenever you're not attached to your thought processes, when you just don't pursue your thoughts and see them arise and disappear. Something that can happen in non-dual states, more dramatic states, in empty states of deep absorption. Maybe all of you have had this very briefly between sleeping and waking. My theory is that the first few hundred milliseconds of the process of waking up, this is actually it. Do you have this sometimes? Before you know who you are, before you know where you are, before you know what time it is, but just the light is coming on. Maybe 200 milliseconds, maybe 300 milliseconds in the process of waking up. I think waking up is very interesting from a philosophical perspective. Look there. Look what is happening when you wake up. How long does it take until you are there and the first person perspective is stable? Then you have it in phases between a normal dream and a lucid dream when you know that you're dreaming. And I'm going to say a little bit about this. The most exciting topic I predict for future philosophy of mind is pure awareness during dreamless sleep. So you don't have to remember all of this, but here are some examples of statistical data. So we had 3,627 submitted responses. I just told you, you can use 1,403. Median age was 52, almost the same number of women and men. Most of the people practiced regularly, had no mental disorders. But you also find, for instance, if you do a large cohort like this, 3% say, although they meditate every day, I do not understand what the concept means. Another 3% say, I have never had this. And leave it immediately. So you find out a lot of details, and we had you can also see very interestingly how people combine different meditation methods. So Vipassana was by far the most often practiced meditation. I should say something why this is interesting. I should make a footnote here. Until now, the people who practice meditation and had this kind of phenomenology were almost always Hindus and Buddhists. They were bound to a religious context and a certain set of metaphysical background assumptions, something that has to do with liberation. We have a historically new situation right now because meditation practice has spread all over the planet. So many people do it, and most of them say they are SNBR. Do you know what that is? Spiritual but not religious. That's a historically new situation. Will they have the same kind of experience, these people? We had people from 57 countries. So if you have these 92 questions, then you find the lowest and rarest thing is pain. Nobody ever has pain because when they have a pure awareness experience. High up there, you have at ease, peace, and relaxation. Total relaxation, but a special kind of relaxation. Now we did a 12-factor analysis of these data, and you can see here, you don't have to remember any of this, I'm coming back to it tomorrow, that there are some things that go through all 6-factor solutions mathematically. So this, for instance, is witness consciousness. I had the experience as if an impersonal observer was present. That has been described in Indian philosophy for more than 2,000 years. That is known in other cultures. But here you also have this go through. So this is the whole luminosity thing. did you have something like brightness, but not like a visual experience, epistemic brightness? It goes through all mathematical solutions, and so does relaxation, peace, but in a special way. So you can imagine you can do very fine-grained phenomenology there. Now I want to slowly come to the end of this first lecture already, to just give you some examples of qualitative analysis, because we discovered a number of things which were unexpected. So I'll just give you some unexpected results. So people had filled in this whole questionnaire. That's a quantitative measure. You can do mathematics, you can expand results. With qualitative analysis, you cannot do this. It's a very different methodology, but we ask people, if you want as a bonus track, right, as an extra, describe a pretty clear, a paradigmatic experience of awareness as such you've had in your own words. Here's a text box, describe it. And you will see a book, I'm almost finished with a book that will present more than 500 of such reports with a qualitative phenomenological analysis. And we learned a lot of these from these people. So we said there's a text box, and describe the experience in your own words, not according to any theory, conceptual framework, or belief system. And that's one of the biggest methodological issues, because many people have learned certain concepts from their meditation teachers. They believe in all kinds of crazy stuff. You know, from a philosophical perspective, this is a minefield. It's a methodological minefield. But you can cancel out a lot of local errors by having a large number. So here are 3 examples of things we didn't think about. The first thing I was surprised was that many people form new metaphors, completely new metaphors, because they understood for hundreds of years, we know this pure awareness experience in meditation. Everybody has said if there's one thing that is ineffable, that is really ineffable. That is something you cannot talk about. You know, don't think about the blueness of blue. That's easy. Qualia, ineffability. But that has been said for centuries is something you cannot speak about. Now, the first thing that happened in the pilot study, an advanced meditator from Switzerland came, you're missing one item. It is dense. The crystal clear silence of awareness itself is dense. Then we put this item in, and then we found people use different countries. People don't know, say things like silvery density. Or they say it's smooth and pristine like silk. So they have a tactile analogy to the awareness experience. Or they say both empty and full, light and dark, velvet and silk. This is something we didn't expect. But if you think about it, density, the continuum of real numbers, there's a point between every other point. The space is a complete space. I don't know if you know the discussion in philosophy around the end of 80s about the ultra smoothness of qualia. There was a technical discussion, philosophers like Michael Lockwood, who said qualia are irreducible because they're ultra smooth. They have no grain. Because they have no grain, they cannot be reduced to anything functional below them, was the argument at the time. Here you have people who don't know all of this, but they say awareness itself is ultra smooth. You know, it has no inner grain. Then the next person came and said Stimmigkeit. Is there a word like this in Swedish? Stimmigkeit? It's actually a term from logic and mathematics. A proof can be sound, coherence. But in German, the German word Stimmigkeit also applies to music. to a global harmony between different sounds, that they all come together. I don't know if there's a Swedish word for it. The English word that comes closest to it, it's an experience of maximal harmony and coherence also. So one person said, it felt like the last puzzle piece you put into a puzzle. Do you know that experience? One rarely has it, but it's a nice experience in life, right? So the idea is entering this state is making a picture complete somehow. And here is something we completely, we didn't have it in the questionnaire. We didn't think about it. And then we got tons of people reporting connectedness. So we have many reports of people who say, this is like distancing oneself into a crystal clear silence that observes, but at the same time being connected to everything, as if holding everything or being touching everything in a non-tactile way, but while being clear and not attached. So here one person said it's like a feeling of stepping back from oneself and being connected to everything at the same time. These are 3 examples of things we didn't expect on the level of metaphors. I'll tell you a little more. So one thing I didn't expect is a flood of metaphors about space. So many people over the centuries say this is a space, but it's not the physical space where you navigate your body. It's a space that has no center and it's unbounded. It has no periphery. And see how different people describe this. For instance, at the bottom, entgrenztes Gehaltensein in German, being unbounded and being held at the same time. Or weightless in the space of infinite possibilities, like in a floating bubble. Total openness that touches openness. Perception of space, unseparated, and it's not inside yourself, and it's also not outside. It's a different kind of space, velvety warm, and simultaneously sharp. And so on and so forth. So we got a flood of space metaphors. And there's this man here who wrote in his 2020 paper, space can be characterized independently of the objects and actions present. And I think we can talk about this tomorrow. There may be a representation of an epistemic space, a highest order epistemic invariance that is independent of epistemic objects and epistemic actions, mental actions like thinking or directing your attention, for instance. So I think what kind of invariance is this experience that pure awareness that you mostly are unaware of, but some people cultivate it? So I want to close by just giving you 2 examples. I'll tell you what my problem is in these 2 lectures. I have so much phenomenological material. I had to choose some things that I thought could be interesting to philosophers. So a very large unexpected cluster is bodyless body experience. I'll keep this short. And a much bigger thing is clear light sleep. So what you very frequently find, and what we didn't expect, if you ask people, describe a very vivid experience of pure awareness, they say, my body boundaries disappeared. There was an indeterminacy in space. So I'll just read something to you. The body felt like it dissolved, and what was left was my awareness, being aware of itself. While I was aware of myself, I also was aware of everything else and the boundaries dissolving here too. I felt like I just was, and my awareness just observed. Another person says, at some point there was a sense that the boundaries had dissolved, that the sound I was hearing from a nearby refrigerator were no different than bodily sensations. The sense of a body had dissolved. There was just experience happening. It didn't feel like a contracted version of a self, rather like an openness, boundless space. The experience was more peaceful and pleasant. I've had a few prior experiences of body lightness and a vibration in other sessions. These sensations were not experienced during body dissolution. And then there's a person, when suddenly the boundary of my body dissolved, I was everywhere at the same time. Attention floated freely in space between the different mind objects. I felt completely at peace. I can just draw your attention to the work. There's a lot of work in Israel happening, Yochai Ataria, on the dissolution of boundaries in meditation by meditators. If you're interested in this, I've thrown this out not to make it so long. And I want to close by something that was also quite unexpected. So I would never believe this, actually. If you believe this, you're strange people. I would never believe this unless I had had this as a young man on a 10-week meditation retreat. So I know it's a real phenomenon. But it has been described that you can be aware during dreamless deep sleep. So the Tibetan Buddhists call this clear light sleep. And here are examples, 2 examples. On a few occasions, I've entered the state of deep dreamless sleep consciously. It is in this state where my experiences have occurred, where I'm a simple unified awareness without the daytime qualities of ego. I've experienced vast, non-centered, timeless space, sometimes light, sometimes pure black, but can really only put inadequate words to the experience. Another person says, pure awareness in dreamless sleep is bright, contentless, unbounded, vivid. Compares it to waking states. And one last example. Yes, I have experiences of pure awareness in non-REM sleep with one caveat, and then he criticizes our questionnaire. The question about the presence of self is not specific enough. That is, autobiographical, core, or body-based self were absent. But the pure awareness was not someone else's awareness, nor some subtle object state I was aware of. Rather, it is that which is and has been aware all along in all experiences. So in that sense, it's me. It's not something other than what you are. This has been described for many centuries as happening in advanced practitioners of meditation. It's also called witnessing sleep. And the philosophical discussion has begun 2015. If you go to my website, you find the Open Mind collection, and there's a target piece by Canadian philosopher Evan Thompson, who coined the concept of lucid dreamless sleep. And my former research assistant Jennifer Wind wrote a very important comment on this, and this is also where the concept of MPE first appeared, not in my work, there. So the idea is there's absolutely no content. You are not immersed into a scene, no thinking, no body. Then there is epistemicity, there's pure knowing, but it is non-personal, it's not reactive. There's just the phenomenology of observation, but without an observer. During dreamless deep sleep, and then presence. So you can find all this freely available online. I would also like to draw your attention to a 2016 TICS paper, where these 2 people and the famous dream researcher Tore Nielsen very interestingly discuss different ways in which there can be conscious experience in dreamless sleep. And here's a young PhD student from Glasgow who thinks this is all nonsense. The concept lucid dreamless sleep is not a good concept because it's not lucid in the same sense like a lucid dream is lucid, because there's no judgment. All of this is not real. because there are no judgments at all. So you see a philosophical discussion is getting off the ground. I should give you one number. In the 1183 reports we had, there are 26 people. We have now phenomenological data from 26 people who have this. So you see it's a very rare phenomenon. You know, it's not something many people have. Just so you know, there is a little bit of neuroscience about witnessing sleep. For instance, about senior Vipassana meditators, where you see the sleep architecture changes. You see all kinds of things from Giulio Tononi's group too. And I want to close this talk by offering a very speculative computational model for you, for discussion maybe. So in the brainstem, there is the ascending reticular activation system. When you wake up in the morning, the brain wakes itself up. This is the thing that activates the cortex. If this is destroyed, you will never be conscious again. You will have the rest of your life in coma. Now think that in the morning, your ARA signal comes on and ignites the cortex. It activates the cortex. It's a necessary precondition for conscious experience. Then the brain is confronted with an unexpected internal signal source, which it has to model and predict. Imagine it tries to model the ARA signal, tries to understand what is coming there, what is activating me, and then uses this model to control the level of tonic alertness, to control that you stay awake, right? So there would be two ways of controlling your alertness, model-based and model-free. So I'm going to say a little bit more about this, but consciousness could have to do with controlling your own tonic alertness by using a model of it, right? The phenomenology, if this model comes up, is I'm awake. This is what you experience when you wake up in the morning. You have a model of your own alertness. Okay, now, last slide. Just imagine the special case that somebody has trained this for thousands of hours. Somebody has cultivated restful alertness, just pure wakefulness without any thoughts for thousands of hours, a Buddhist monk or so. And then this is downregulated, right? The brainstem downregulates this because the person goes to sleep, but this model remains as a standalone computational feature. It still remains. Then the prediction would be that you have the experience of wakefulness without any content in a low arousal state of the brain during non-REM sleep. That is highly speculative, but I think this is where we eventually have to go. And why would this be interesting? Why would it be interesting if we had, for instance, the neurocorrelates and a computational model of this phenomenology of witnessing sleep? Well, it would be interesting because then you would have the purest form of consciousness in an isolated form. This is where somebody just spontaneously enjoys the experience of awareness itself, without an ego and without any content. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it has to do with the foreground-background distinction, which I think is everywhere in normal perception. I've been watching you, but nonetheless there have been things around. I could have switched my head and looked to the left, to the right, but I didn't. Now, one hypothesis that you may make me delete is that I think that the kind of self-knowledge, not just a substantial self, but a kind of that I am perceiving, I am thinking, I am dreaming, is there as a kind of background awareness that can never become a foreground awareness. And if you think about how the notion of self-consciousness really entered European philosophy, it was, to my mind, with Kant. And he said that all experiences are accompanied with the notion of I think or I cognize. And I take that to be the same kind of observation. You can never have this in front of you, but it's there nonetheless. Now, when you make all these interviews and reports, observations, do you make them aware of the fact that there might be a foreground, background distinction? And if they are not observant on that, they may come up with wrong descriptions. They only look what's in the foreground, but there is something more. Do you understand my question, I guess?
Oh, yes, I understand it very well. So there are a number of things. So tomorrow, I don't know where to start. So if you talk to people like this, there is something like a phenomenology of eversion that is sometimes, in the German word is Umstülpung. I don't know what it is. Like if you take a sock and you pull it out, that the sock is the wrong way around. Some people describe an experience in which everything stays the same, but it's like the model of reality has been everted. What was previously the most subtle abstract background is now the most dominant foreground. One person said, it's not a donkey looking into a well, it's the well looking at the donkey. That's a possible phenomenology, right? So there are a number of things there. You mentioned Kant. Tomorrow, I'm getting ahead of myself, but tomorrow I'm going to show you some examples. Philosophers know when they talk about transcendentals, they always say, always already. In German they say immer schon und schon immer. You know, the conditions of possibility. What was striking to us is that some of these people who you can guarantee they've never read Kant and they don't know transcendental philosophy say it is always already. I'm going to show you some examples about this tomorrow. I think Kant was very impure in thinking that this was a thought, an egoic thought that could accompany everything. But we do find a phenomenology of transcendentality. And then there's, of course, this completely... How many of you have heard the word non-dual awareness ever in their life? Okay, so a common theme in texts and discussions about this is that there can be a phenomenology in which the experiencing subject and an object component are both not represented. So subject-object structure has disappeared, but conscious experience is there. And that is, of course, also related to your question, because there would be a non-dual background, which is devoid of the distinction between subject and object, which makes everything conscious. That's an old theory. But the thing is, you cannot look at it, because every attempt to look at it, of course, destroys it, right? And we find this at the origins, just after Frege. We find it in G.E. Moore in Cambridge. He said, there is something you can discover, the consciousness itself. It's in that paper. You can look in the paper I've written, but you must not fix attention, because in the moment you fix attention, you import this dual structure and you destroy this. The most beautiful metaphorical description I know for this background-foreground dialectic is, you can frequently find it from the 8th century onward in Tibetan Buddhists. And they say it's like a space. The metaphor is space, but it's not physical space. It's knowing space. It's an epistemic space. And if I had asked you, can you point to space? Of course you cannot. Physically, you cannot point to space, because every movement, pointing movement, is already taking place in space. If I would ask you, can you grasp space? You cannot do that, because the grasping movement takes place in physical space. And the idea of these Tibetan Buddhists is exactly the same for the space of pure awareness. You cannot point to it with your attention, and you cannot grasp it with thought, because the movement of attention and the movement of thought already takes place in this epistemic space. It's, so to speak, saturated by this background that makes it possible. And so I think there have been many people across the centuries who try to somehow describe what you're getting at, and it's difficult. You know what background, come to the beginning of your question, you know, everybody knows what a background-foreground flip is. You know that in your perception. But could there be a highest order background-foreground flip? How would that look? That's the question.
Yeah, I wait until tomorrow, but just for your knowledge, I know Moore's remark very well. It's in the paper Refutation of Idealism, where he says that there is always consciousness of consciousness without bringing in something ego-like. There is just, so to speak, a pure consciousness about consciousness. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
If you go to the 2020 open access paper I've really shown, I've taken the many of the most important passages in Moore out for you, and you strikingly find he even uses the concept of emptiness, and he certainly didn't know anything about Buddhist philosophy, you know.
I will just ask a very short question. I think somewhere in the beginning you said that this type of consciousness does not even have to have time representations. So then I wonder what you mean with time representation in this sense.
Yeah, so you have different kinds of temporal content in conscious experience. One is, for instance, non-identity. There's a very low threshold at 15 milliseconds where you know two tones in your ears, where at different times, but you cannot say which one was the first tone. Then there is something above 30 milliseconds that is an ordering threshold, where you can say right was first, left was first. Then you have this multimodally with touch and sight and sound. Another kind of temporal content is duration, right? Yet another form of temporal content is what William James called about the species present, the experience of the now. I'm claiming all of these things are absent in this form of conscious experience. And I think there's a frequent conflation. Many meditators say, I was absolutely in the present moment, because they learned to speak like this from their meditation teachers, but actually it was an experience of timelessness. So I think the simplest thing would probably be self-location in time, the experience of nowness, but there's also something, you could say, a phenomenology of eternity or a phenomenology of timelessness. That's what I mean, but you probably have another question, right?
I don't know, but if there is space, as you talked about, epistemic space,
Yes.
there should be time, even if, I mean, representation is a special word, but you don't have to be aware of time to have it represented, because it's very difficult to be outside time if you exist, if you follow what I mean.
Well, Brentano, 1874, and the previous speaker, Daniel Dennett, both have said that the representation of absence is not the same as the absence of representation. Is that what you're getting at? That time might not be represented, but that it is a necessary functional precondition?
Yes, that's what I mean. By existing, you are somehow, because I don't like the word representation here, but even all life represents time by just being there. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And you cannot really be conscious without being in time. Even if it doesn't matter how you represent it, it's there. But you're talking about the feeling of representing it, I guess.
Well, I think there is no temporal content, but this doesn't exclude the possible. If you make an old-fashioned distinction between representational content and carrier, that what generates the phenomenology in the brain, in a living embodied organism, of course can have temporal properties. It could also be the case, if you take the latest mathematical models, that the predictive horizon for this kind of experience is very short, that it's not zero, but it's very short. You know, it just, so to speak, predicts its own activation all the time. So I'm a naturalist, so I would be absolutely open that the computational processes that implement this must have temporal properties. But couldn't it be the case that for the organism, this is an experience of timelessness still?
Yes, a very unusual experience. So you think of it as it's not being time, but your thoughts are tricking you.
If you think about it, you're back in time. As soon as you've had one thought or recognize it, it's all gone, of course. Yeah.
I'm interested in your idea about the brainstem sending signals to us to wake up, and you say that the cortex then built a model of this kind of thing that comes in. So I asked the evolutionary question, what's the use of this model?
Yes.
And following question is, how does that connect to what you write in your paper with Chris Frith about the agency being part of this self-consciousness? I mean, is this minimal model of wakefulness related to agency?
Well, yes, in evolution, the most deepest thing was we had to keep a lot of vital parameters in very narrow windows. Blood sugar, blood oxygen, body temperature. And the computational processes that control this had to be very robust and stable, because you're dead if you don't manage to do this. You have no second chance. I think in beings like us, there is a vital parameter that has been overlooked by computational modelers so far, and that's the level of tonic alertness. So there's phasic alertness. If I go like this and you have a sudden sound, you become alert. That's not the alertness I'm speaking about. Tonic alertness only fluctuates on the order of minutes or hours, and there's neuroscience about it. And it is, I've written a bit about it, it's the readiness, not for executive control, the readiness for attentional control and cognitive control. It is the readiness to orient yourself in time and space. That's when you wake up, you suddenly know where you are. And it's, of course, also the possibility for autobiographical memory. On a very low level, you can say tonic alertness is stimulus readiness of the brain. Are you ready to receive and process stimuli at all, or are you closed to the world? And I think for intelligent beings, conscious beings like us, it was extremely important to control the level of your alertness, You also see we have to sleep, we have to dream. It's something very expensive, complicated. We are not able to be awake all day. And an interesting point, I think that is overlooked by many philosophers, is that there is the functional property of tonic alertness, and there's the phenomenal property of wakefulness. And there are some coma patients, certain kinds of coma, where this can come apart. In German, it was actually called Wachkoma, waking coma, vegetative coma, where the patient has absolutely no conscious experience. They don't know that they exist or have ever existed, but they have a wake-sleep cycle. They go to sleep, the body goes to sleep, you have REM phases, dream phases, they even have open eyes and gaze following movements, which make it very hard for the relatives to understand that there's nobody in there anymore. You go through the room to do something to flowers and the eyes follow automatically. So there you have a case where you have a dissociation of functional tonic alertness and the conscious experience of wakefulness. And I think that's highly speculative. That is just, to put it very simple, you have to know that you're alert, have a representation, a model, whatever you want to say about it. And if you don't know that you're alert, you're in coma. And that, I think, is the difference. I think it all has nothing to do with egoic self-consciousness. That is something that comes at a much later stage. But maybe I haven't understood your question there.
Very well. What you describe sounds more like we enter a state of vigilance. We would find out whether something is dangerous is approaching when we have this stage.
Yes, so what I have done, I've gone as a philosopher into the neuroscience literature and tried to read everything I could find about brainstem, arousal, waking up, and surprise. From a philosopher's perspective, the empirical literature is a total mess. It's, they use vigilance, they use arousal, they use wakefulness, they use tonic alertness, and everybody uses it in a different way. So it needs philosophers to go in there and clean this mess up. They are conceptually confused. They try to impress us with data, but they don't actually know what they're talking about. And one candidate is, then the organism is vigilant. What does that mean? So one thing philosophers have to bring to this discussion also is to develop clear conceptual instruments other people can work with, I think.
Thank you very much. These naturalistic explanations are, of course, very interesting, but if we can go back to the experience side again, and phenomenology. You mentioned the term many times, but not the philosophical tradition from Husserl to Zahavi.
Yes.
Apart from a very oblique reference with a picture by Merleau-Ponty that you had in the middle. And I know that you're mentioned several times as not being a fan of that tradition. But if we put those kind of ideological, political sides of metaphysical, if we go back to the experiences, both the first and the second question, the first was, in phenomenological terms, is very much about pre-reflective self-consciousness.
Yes.
That has been elaborated marvelously in many analyses, in Sartre, for example. And the second could be about inner time consciousness.
Yes.
That Zahavi persuasively, argues is a precondition for phenomenal experience.
Yes.
So if we take these inner time consciousness from Husserl to Zahavi, how does that relate, for example, to your quest for a minimal pure awareness?
Well, as I'm going to explain tomorrow, there is, of course, it's good that you bring this up. There's this whole tradition, with Fichte, Sartre, Henrich, Manfred Frank, Zahavi on pre-reflective self-consciousness. What we have now evidence for is, I think, something more fundamental. I'm going to explain tomorrow. Non-egoic self-awareness. There is a kind of self-awareness. These people all think this is selfie, egoic, but precognitive, embodied. And I've also written a bit about this. But I think there's even a deeper level. A level that is absolutely non-egoic, where the awareness is non-conceptually aware of it. And I thought of itself. And I thought it would be a major addition to that research tradition if one created some really solid phenomenological data. I'm going to say a little bit about this tomorrow. The problem, of course, is I am now saying I only want to look at the phenomenology as carefully as I can to prepare a research program. But as you're going to see a little bit more tomorrow, there is epistemological deep water, because it is part, if you take the phenomenology seriously, I have experiences in my database where the whole point is this is not phenomenal consciousness, this is noumenal consciousness. So there is a phenomenology of transcendentality. So one thing I now don't have to speculate about it because I have data is there are people who say this is not an experience. And that's philosophically interesting. How you take a phenomenological report seriously where there is one of my anonymous reviewers wrote this, I don't know how to say this in English, well, a purport to insight, to immediate knowledge, to direct epistemic contact with something that is not phenomenal anymore. You can just do research and describe this and say, yeah, there are people who say this is not an experience. There are people who say, yeah, this is what precedes all experiences. There are people who say this is what is timeless and enables inner time consciousness. I now have this. I have this. How do you treat reports like this in an intellectually honest way? Because what I find if I look into Eastern philosophy, they don't often have the distinction, say, between epistemology and metaphysics we have in our Western tradition. For them, it doesn't make so much sense to say, how do you know this is not an illusion? Or how do you know that this is an insight because there is a phenomenology of insight? Don't you need independent epistemic justification for it? The problem is there are other philosophical cultures on this planet who wouldn't understand the question. If we say, don't you have to distinguish between, the transcendental metaphysics of inner time consciousness and how it appears to you, because they have never evolved these conceptual distinctions. But they have involved fantastically deep traditions of non-conceptual investigation. They have millions of hours of meditation practice and come back with something that is for them an obvious result. And then we say, yeah, okay, this is how it appears to you, right? So there's a lot of deep water, and I don't have an answer to the epistemological questions, but I also see, of course, that many people in our own tradition have seen this, but always turned it to an egoic question. It's always, if you think of the late Husserl, it's a transcendental ego. If you think of Kant, this cognitive, it's an egoic cognitive act that can accompany everything. And these philosophical traditions have said, no, there is something where you can transcend the passions and you can transcend time and the self, but it's non-egoic. And I have no idea how to bring this together. So to come back to your question, it plays a role for me. I'm trying to do something better that creates progress. And I like Brentano more than Husserl.
Thank you for first lecture. My question is regarding the distinction between minimal phenomenal selfhood and minimal phenomenal experience.
Yes.
So in several of the reports from the meditators, they reported things kind of identifying themselves with this experience. I was unbounded, I was looking, or I was being held. Mm-hmm. wouldn't this make minimal phenomenal experience a more minimal kind of selfhood in these regarding these reports? Or
this is exactly the question. So I'm going to come back to it tomorrow. Is it only the grammar, the surface grammar of the natural language they're using? They are not philosophers, most of them. That just makes them talk about it. On the other hand, you have a century old philosophical debate, for instance, between Advaita Vedanta philosophers and Buddhists. One of them says, this thing is your true self. That's the real self. And there's another tradition that says, no, no self anywhere. This is absolutely selfless. There's a 2011 Oxford University Press reader. It's called Self, No Self, for those who are interested, where they discuss, discuss these questions. This gives us many interesting philosophical questions. Could somebody, for instance, have a phenomenology of selflessness and report it in this linguistic format afterwards? There's also a discussion now starting. We have empirical evidence for ego dissolution under psychedelics and in meditation, complete dissolution of egoic self-awareness. But what's the epistemological status of reports? I said this in 2003 in my book. If somebody said, I have had an experience where I wasn't there, there is, intuitively, I said, intuitively, I think that's a performative fallacy. You claim to have an autobiographical memory of an episode where no self was present at the time. How can you remember that? There is a deep intuitive puzzle, but there are a number of philosophers who are now getting in on the issue and say, this is no problem at all. There's a second-order metacognitive act in building autobiographical memory. So the question is, can we believe such reports? If somebody says, there was no self, I had no self, can we just say, ha, 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 you had no self? And just say this is philosophically uninteresting because it's a contradiction somehow. Or is there something deep and valuable there? But then we have to say people somehow misreported. Could we give them the conceptual tools to report it in a better way? I'm going to propose one such tool tomorrow. Yeah.
Thanks so much. This was really rich. I've got lots of questions, but I have two which I think one leads to the other. So I'm going to say them both and then try and say a little bit why I think one will take us to the second one. So the first question is, or maybe it's an invitation to say a little bit more about what you mean by simplicity.
Mm-hmm.
And the second question is really what is motivating this kind of pursuit of minimality, of minimal conscious experience. And the reason I think they're connected is something like so if we start with the question, what do you mean by simplicity? Mm-hmm. Some people wouldn't go to meditators in their search for simplicity. They would go for maybe babies or less cognitively developed animals, for instance. And you've gone to meditators, and I guess there's kind of a concern there, which is that the notion of simplicity or also purity, which you use for meditators, has a lot of cultural baggage, which is attached to it. And so that's a kind of a concern. And then tied to that is, of course, that meditators have to do so much work to get this simplicity.
They have to stop working.
Okay. Okay, but at least they need to put some practice in, right?
So sorry, I didn't want to interrupt.
Oh no, it's okay. And so I just kind of to tie them up. It was the thought that if this notion of simplicity is kind of takes so much to get to, is it I mean, usually when people want minimality, they want it because then they can use that as a basis for exploring all conscious experience. But it seems like this is not going to work as a kind of basis. You're not going to learn something about consciousness per se. You're going to learn something about a very particular kind of experience. So I was just
Very
kind of
good,
wondering.
very good, very excellent, excellent point. So start with the most simple question first. What motivates this? That's simple. Try a minimal model explanation for consciousness. Given the new computational tools we have from predictive processing and so forth, could we come up with another avenue of research into consciousness? The second point you made is absolutely clear and important. The minimality, that is where the philosophers and the mathematicians actually have to do their work. That's the conceptual issue. What does minimality actually mean? And that is really deep water because, for an example, we created through pilot studies this 92-dimensional questionnaire. So we have statistical data in this 92-dimensional space now. You could define simplicity in there, but where do these 92 dimensions come from? I can tell you where they come from. They come from the fact that I have meditated for more than 45 years, 2 times a day, and that the expert meditators we used in our pilot studies were also long-term practitioners. This can have put a lot of unnoticed bias in this, all kinds of distortions we're not aware of. So it's a deep question for mathematicians and philosophers, what would minimal really mean? Second, the first slide I think I'm going to show tomorrow is the point you made at the end. I call this the C fallacy. The C fallacy is that you think from reports in which people say they have experienced consciousness per se or consciousness as such, you can kind of boot a theory of consciousness out of these reports. There are other such fallacies, but I'm going to say this at the very beginning tomorrow, this wouldn't work. You cannot just because you have, if you had 1,000 reports of people saying, I think I'm experiencing consciousness per se. From a more rigorous methodological and philosophical perspective, this doesn't help you. You cannot boot into a theory of consciousness from there. It may be a strong indicator for lots of things. It's interesting, you know, it shows relevance. But you're absolutely right. That would be committing what I call the C fallacy, and the same is true for pure. Of course, we have centuries of philosophical literature about pure consciousness. But I'm going to show you a list of 6 interpretations of pure tomorrow. You know, if you just look at the literature or look at what our people say in those reports, pure doesn't mean the same for everybody. I'll just give you the two most paradigmatic interpretations. Most people think pure consciousness is when you have no thoughts. Your mind is entirely calm, but crystal clear. But you can still open your eyes, or be with your breath, or your body sensations. No thoughts. That's one interpretation. Another interpretation is no content except the character of awareness itself. That's a little more dramatic. There's a word for it. I'll tell you the word tomorrow. It's called a full absorption episode, where that's the only thing. These are the 2 most important interpretations of purity. But there are others. For instance, if you think about the history of consciousness in the West, conscientia, the Latin precursor and Christian philosophy, to be conscious means to have higher order moral judgments and an ideal observer in your mind. To constantly monitor your own mental actions if they are sinful or not, if they are, normatively, from a moral perspective. Then you can have a pure consciousness. According to this classical Christian definition of conscientia, I guess most of you are totally unaware right now. You know, the idea that morality is what makes you really conscious, and so on and so forth. So purity is ill-defined. We don't know what minimality is. I'm just trying to make a start. That's all.